From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Is the Biden administration's student loan forgiveness move backfiring? An intriguing new poll suggests most Americans see it as a political move and unfair. Plus, the Federal Reserve meets Wednesday to decide on the size of another interest rate hike. What to expect, what comes next, and does the Fed actually have a plan? Welcome to Potomac Watch. I'm Kim Strassel, and I'm here today with two of my amazing colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Joe Sternberg. And in late August, President Biden waved his magic wand, saying he'd cancel student debt for some 40 million borrowers. The government will cancel $10,000 for borrowers making $125,000 or less a year, $20,000 for those who received Pell Grants. Let's put aside the complex question of whether the president remotely has the authority for such a move and look at why Democrats did it. They thought it would be popular. You go back to the 2020 election, Democrats have been calling for this, and then after 2 years of using emergency COVID authority to put off loan repayments, Biden finally acted on forgiveness, figuring it would give Democrats a big boost before the election. But Alicia, there are some really growing indications that this might be a political miscalculation. And one piece of evidence is a new poll that's out from Issues and Insights and TIP conducted in early September that shows that by a margin of 59% to 32%, Americans agreed with this statement, that Biden's student loan forgiveness plan, quote, is unfair to those whose children are not in college or who have already paid for their kids' education to have to pay for other people's education. Another 8% called themselves unsure. So that's a pretty striking number. And moreover, the other thing that jumped out at me in this, Alicia, is bipartisan. Republicans said it was unfair at the highest rate, 67%, but you also had Democrats at 55% and independents at 56%. So what's going on here, Alicia? Because usually when government makes something free, it's popular, but this is not seeming to work out for Democrats.
Right. And so I'm a little actually perplexed by some of the polling on this because Politico released a poll the other day showing that it was actually widely supported, even a third among Republicans. And actually, a Cato poll earlier this month showed that 64% of Americans support the federal government for giving up to $10,000 in federal student loans. But the rub seems to be how the question is asked and framed. As you mentioned in the poll that you cited, it was framed about in terms of whether it was fair. When Cato asked whether they would support loan forgiveness if it meant raising taxes or if it meant benefiting primarily higher income people, about 2/3 opposed it. They also oppose it if it could lead to inflation. So it's really a matter of how the issue is framed. A lot of people really don't think about the collateral consequences of the loan forgiveness. Some people think, well, a lot of kids or young people did take out some student loans and these are that they can't now repay, and $10,000. Well, in the big scheme of things, that's not that huge. And these, young people, at least in the way Democrats are portraying this, is that they're really struggling to make ends meet. They can't afford the rent. They can't afford food. None of this is true, of course. But Democrats have obscured the issues and obscured the consequences of the student loan forgiveness. And to that effect, I think that the public opinion is kind of mixed on this. And I think Republicans have an opportunity. I think they need to underline the consequences and that it will just cause colleges to increase tuition for the students now in school and who will go to school in the future. But it also creates perverse incentives, especially, there's this moral hazard issue. It encourages kids and parents to take out more debt than they can repay. And there's the idea that, well, then the government will eventually forgive it, if not right now. We'll do the same thing that Biden is doing in another few years, and this will just be a rolling loan forgiveness.
Usually when Democrats are out there supporting and promoting government transfer programs, they really are able to make the argument, or they try very hard and at least have some evidence on their side, that the program is supposed to benefit those who are poor, those who are struggling. And the White House is certainly trying to cast that as this, throwing out a bunch of numbers to suggest that loan forgiveness will disproportionately help minorities, etc. But if you look at actual analysis, the Nonpartisan Committee for Responsible Federal supplemental budget found, for instance, that when Biden was moving to pause loan repayments and interest rates during COVID, it was actually a huge giveaway to the wealthy. On average, it was gifted to those with medical degrees with like $48,000 in benefits, and those with law degrees to the tune of about $30,000 in benefits. This is not what most people identify with as your struggling post-college student. So I think a lot of that seems to have to do with this fundamental argument in America that things should be fair and that if we're transferring money, it should be going to those most in need. It doesn't seem like that is the case here. And does that seem to be part of the problem when you get into these polls?
This is the kind of political situation that probably a lot of the progressives who bounced Biden into this forgiveness would have benefited if they had read the Federalist Papers while they were obtaining these expensive degrees that they're struggling to pay off. Because, see, their default assumption was that something like debt forgiveness for student loans had not happened already because there was some kind of breakdown in the representative system in Congress. Instead, that failure was a signal. It was a signal that was saying, look, this issue is very complicated. It is not at all clear-cut who ends up benefiting the most from this kind of debt forgiveness program. There are a lot of costs. You can't look at this issue in isolation. You also have to think about how it's going to be paid for and who's going to do the paying. And they could have very easily extracted a pretty simple lesson from the observation that the Congress, the branch of government that is always tasked with trying to work out these complex moving parts, had concluded that debt forgiveness was not something that lawmakers were prepared to do. So, as someone who obtained a medium-priced degree and did read some of the Federalist Papers, I find myself here kind of chuckling as they are discovering anew they're running into these potential political problems where this policy move might not pay off for them at the ballot box the way they hoped it would, because they didn't understand that there was a significance to the fact that it hadn't been done before.
Yeah, Joe, I agree with all of that, except for I would actually argue that everyone should continue to read the Federalist Papers, even now, post-college. What do you say to that?
Oh, I'm absolutely on board with that.
So here's another indication, though, that maybe this is not going over well, and possibly a more surefire indication than the polls. Alicia, we now have a number of Senate Democrats that are coming out and barely weeks after the White House made this announcement are already asking that this loan forgiveness program be extended to parents. Can you just tell listeners a little bit about what's that about and what do you think is driving that Democratic ask?
So there's a Parent Plus loan program that allows parents to take out somewhat higher interest rate loans to fund their child's education. I say somewhat higher because they're still much lower than they would get in a private market, but they're somewhat higher than the students themselves are taking out. And these loans are generally uncapped. Now, the Biden program, or the Biden loan forgiveness program, would allow parents to qualify for up to $10,000 in loan forgiveness, but not extra $20,000 if their kids receive Pell Grants. And so now there's a big push among some of the progressive senators for them to qualify for that extra $20,000, as well as to qualify for these more generous income-based repayment plans. This, I think, is actually the biggest scam of the plan, is these income-based repayment plans that Democrats initially established in 2010 as part of Obamacare, allowed students to cap their loan payments at 10% of their income and have the remaining balance forgiven after 20 years. This means that you never have to pay more than 10% of your, and it's actually discretionary income. So that excludes, for many students, about a third of their income. This was initially intended only for students, future students, and then Obama, by executive fiat, extended this program to older students and former students. And now this new program that Biden has set up is now capping the loan payments at just a mere 5% of income. And again, forgiving the remaining balance after 20 years. I believe the Biden administration estimated that this could save many borrowers $2,000 to $3,000 every year. So this is just a $2,000 to $3,000 giveaway every year. So you can see how the cost could pile up over time. I think the UPenn Wharton budget model, a lot of the uncertainty it projected was based on how many students are going to enroll in these programs. on these plans, going back to your question about the parents would not qualify, or under the terms of the Biden plan, would not qualify for these payment programs. So now the Democratic senators want to make them eligible too, and eligible for this write-off after 20 years. I mean, that would be a huge giveaway and would blow up the cost of the program. But I believe the reason why Democrats are doing this is because a lot of parents are kind of pissed off that, hey, I took out a lot of loans to help my kid or that is college education, and I'm not getting my loans forgiven. I'm not eligible for these, very generous repayment plans. And so I think the Democratic senators are trying to mount a response to that, the political pushback that they're seeing among some parents about the unfairness of the loan forgiveness.
Yeah, it's hard to see how that would help, especially, we're now beginning to see a lot of Republicans pick this up and use it out on the campaign trail and use it as part of this midterm strategy. Let's listen to Senator Ted Cruz talking about this recently.
Biden's student loan giveaway is facially illegal. There is zero authority under federal law for him to give away $1 trillion. This is an election year gambit. He's trying to buy votes because he recognizes that Democrats are headed to a very bad election in November. But $1 trillion at a time when inflation is exploding, the fact that Joe Biden says, let's add another trillion on top of it, is wildly irresponsible. It will drive up your costs.
Yeah, so Joe, you do see out on the campaign trail folks like Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, who obviously has had a lot of attention last year, running on the education issue more broadly, school choice, parental control. You see Ted Cruz there talking about this and very directly claiming this is a vote buying scheme. There was another poll that was out showing that a majority of voters said that they would be less likely to back a candidate who was in favor of this forgiveness plan. That might come down to whether or not they knew the details or not. But is education writ large and this particular aspect of it, student loans, do you think this is likely to have some legs going into this election, or is it just more noise amid the bigger news of inflation in the economy?
I think there are two angles on this student debt forgiveness. If it's going to have legs, these are the two things that are going to do it. So, I mean, the first is kind of a point which I think some Republicans like Ted Cruz are sort of getting at, although he didn't directly say it in the clip that we played, which is you've got the situation where now President Biden is proposing that Washington is going to spend an astronomical sum of money to bail out college borrowers when the majority of Americans have not gone to college. And even many of those who have already repaid all of their loans or are in a position to repay without feeling any great household financial distress about doing that. So the population of beneficiaries here is certainly very noisy, especially within progressive political circles, but they are not necessarily very numerous. And I think that kind of imbalance between the relatively small number of beneficiaries and the relatively large number of taxpayers who are on the hook for that creates a real problem for Democrats. This is very different from their normal strategy of saying we're going to tax a couple hundred rich people to give benefits to many millions of people. The numbers are completely reversed here. So I think that's one problem. I think there's a more subtle problem here, which is significant, but might be a little too nuanced for the last 2 months of the midterm election. And that is, why do we even borrow for college? This started decades ago because the theory became that a college degree was a form of human capital. And so in the same way that you might take out a loan so that you could accumulate physical capital like a house, you would take out a loan so that you could pay for the college degree, and then it would pay for itself over time because of the increased earnings power. People are in the situation of experiencing financial distress paying back these loans because that, for some of them, turns out to be a terrible financial deal. And the reason for that really often goes back to the quality of the things that people are being taught in modern American universities, and the fact that we have this higher education system that has a very high opinion of itself and a relatively low ability to prepare people for well-paid careers, particularly, these people who are in the bubble going to community colleges or less prestigious schools, maybe not finishing, and American universities don't have anything to say to them. This should be an opening for Republicans to really talk about what we're going to do about reforming higher education and creating better educational pathways than just the traditional four-year undergraduate degree for all kinds of Americans to get into all kinds of careers in the labor market. And that would be more compelling than talking about shifting financial benefits to a relatively small number of people compared to the number of taxpayers who have to fund it all.